All right, I'm back. The second lecture of the conflict chapter is going to look at the specific strategies that are available to use as you start resolving conflict, and then also looking at some things to say, okay, well, when should you use a particular strategy? So maybe giving you some guidelines or some guidance on when is it best to use a particular approach. But first, we're just going to look at the different options, the different strategies that you can use, and then we'll really kind of hone in on kind of the ideal strategy and look at some kind of guidelines for that. So you can see up on the screen the different strategies that are out there. There's 5 strategies that we're going to look at, and you can see how they're measured. So you can see on the left-hand side, it's looking at kind of assertiveness. So looking at unassertive all the way up the line to being more assertive. And then this idea of cooperativeness along the bottom, which is looking at your attempt to satisfy the other party's concerns. So if you have a focus on the other party more than your own, then you kind of have this high cooperativeness, where if you aren't concerned about the other party, then you would be on the lower end. And so the relationship between assertiveness and cooperativeness get you to a particular strategy. All right, so it's important that you're able to not just memorize where the sources or the strategies fall on the chart right now, but if I would say, if I have a high concern for the other party, but I also have a high concern for myself, for my own concerns, what strategy would you suggest? All right, so ideally you'd be able to answer that question. So, high concern for others would get us to the high cooperativeness, and a high concern for myself would indicate that I'm assertive, and those 2 points would meet at a collaborating strategy. Okay, so make sure that you can identify a particular strategy based on kind of those descriptors. All right, so we'll just go through each of them one by one. And so we're going to look at kind of the first strategy as being forcing. All right, so when we look at forcing, that the chart would indicate that there's a high concern. It's up there with assertiveness, right? So high concern for myself, a low concern for the other person, the other party involved. And so you can see the first point of forcing is satisfy personal needs at the expense of the other person, because I don't really care about that other person. When you use a forcing strategy, you're more concerned about getting your way. You might use kind of formal authority if you have that power over the other person. You might see this kind of in a bullying situation, manipulating. Sorry about that. Manipulating the other person. And so it's not an ideal strategy by any means. It's definitely a strategy depending on the situation. But, over time, if a forcing strategy is kind of your go-to strategy anytime you're in a conflict, you really will ruin that relationship if you care, but typically you don't care about the other person in a forcing kind of situation. You feel vindicated. However, the other person feels defeated. You get your way in a forcing approach, and it's this is what we're going to do, and this is the solution we're going to use, whether you like it or not, and you kind of force your way into that solution. The next strategy is avoiding. So you can see avoiding is there on the bottom left. So it's I don't really care about my own concerns, and I don't really care about the other person's concerns either. So you really are neglecting both parties' interests. You're sidestepping it, you're postponing it, probably because you don't like confrontation, and so you choose to avoid it. The outcome of avoiding is nothing. Nothing gets accomplished, obviously, because it's not potentially brought to the other person's attention that there's even a conflict there. And most likely, things are going to get worse. And so it's going to keep festering. It's going to keep bothering you until it kind of just explodes, and and is probably worse than what it was if you would have just initially taken care of the situation, okay, and had that conversation. So again, avoiding is a strategy, just not one that you want to use often. And we'll look at some times where maybe avoiding is appropriate, but again, probably should not be your go-to strategy when trying to manage conflict. The third approach is accommodating. So accommodating, you can see, is high on cooperativeness. So someone who's an accommodator is very concerned about making sure the other party is happy, but they have a low concern for themselves. All right, so they kind of put their feelings aside and just are really focused on the other person. All right, so they satisfy the other party's concerns but neglect your own. It is a way to preserve the relationship because, again, the other person ends happy, the other person kind of wins in these conflict situations, and so it is a way to help kind of reserve that or preserve that relationship. Over time, if you're an accommodator and this is your kind of go-to strategy, you can see that people will start taking advantage of you. So they know that if they just push a little bit, you're going to cave, type of thing. And it really can hurt your credibility, because what I'll tell accommodators, because I am prone to accommodating, and if I really don't kind of think through things, I'm very concerned about the other party, and I like when everyone's happy, that type of thing. And so I've really had to learn that this is not healthy always to be the go-to. And so what I've learned is that when I accommodate, the other party is happy, but the people around aren't maybe as happy. All right, and that's where you start losing some credibility. For instance, if we use kind of the classroom, when I first started teaching, I was very concerned about the students and making sure the students were happy. And I had these policies in my classroom, and I would have a student come to me kind of with their sob story, and they needed me to kind of be lenient on the policy, and they needed me to, just not apply the policy to them, type of thing. And so I would kind of fall for it. And so I wanted to apply the policy to them. They're happy, right? Because they get an extension on the deadline or whatever it might be, or they don't get a 0. But now, other students who hear about this are kind of frustrated because they got their paper in on time, or they did things the right way, even though, they probably had to jump through some hoops to make sure it got done. But here I am accommodating this other individual and maybe losing some credibility with, a lot of my other students in those situations. Now, there are times where, now I will accommodate students, depending on their situation, because I get that things happen. And there are those situations where accommodating definitely makes sense. But again, it should not be your go-to, because people start kind of recognizing this and really can start taking advantage of you. The fourth approach is compromising. So you can see that being right in the middle. So you have some concern for yourself and you have some concern for the other party. So you kind of get partial satisfaction from both parties. The idea behind compromising, that it is quick, I guess, to reach a compromise in a sense. I mean, there's this negotiation that goes back and forth, but you're not always getting the best solution when you try to compromise. You're doing something that partially satisfies both people, but not fully. All right. And so we don't want to, again, always just go to compromise as our go-to strategy. And then the last one is collaborating. And so collaborating is the ideal approach, because you can see that it seeks to address both parties. So the collaborating strategy has a high concern for yourself and a high concern for the other party. And so it really becomes kind of this win-win kind of approach. And so when you look at the outcome, the ideal kind of thing with a conflict is that the problem gets resolved. And when we really take the time to collaborate and come to a solution that meets both parties' needs fully, then most likely the problem gets resolved and both parties are really committed to making sure that the solution gets implemented correctly. So which approach is best? The answer that no one likes is it just really depends. There's no single approach that will always work or that is always best given the situation. And so as a manager, you need to be flexible and be able to use different approaches depending on what the situation kind of demands. So some things to think about when you're trying to figure out what strategy to use are these situational considerations. And so when you're looking at a situation, some things you can ask yourself is, how important is the issue? Right? So is the issue extremely important to you? And if you say yes, then most likely your only two options are forcing or collaborating, right? Because again, if you look at that chart, I have a high concern for myself. I'm very concerned about this issue, and I'm not just going to cave. I'm not just going to give in to what the other person wants, and I'm not just going to avoid this because I'm so passionate about this issue. And so now, right there with that, first kind of consideration, I narrow it down to two approaches, all right, to two strategies. All right. Now, if the issue's not that important, maybe this is a time to kind of let the other person win, right? And I accommodate them because it's important to them. It's not that important to me. And, maybe so I have more concern for them at that point. How important is the relationship? So if the relationship is highly important, then I probably am concerned about the other person, right? And so I have a high cooperativeness kind of focus or emphasis. And so I want to use a strategy that kind of is on that end, so that now we're at accommodating or collaborating. Now, if I kind of give you an example of what if the issue is highly important to me, right? And the relationship is highly important to me, right? That gets us to one option, right? And that's collaborating, right? If I go look up at, it's really important to me that I'm high assertiveness, right? And I have forcing or collaborating at that point. Right? If I'm looking at cooperativeness and I'm high cooperativeness, right? Because I'm concerned about the other person because that relationship is important, then I have accommodating or collaborating, right? And so the one that's in common there is collaborating. Now, if I did not care, if the relationship was not important to me, then, maybe I use a forcing approach because I want to make sure that I get my way because the issue is really important to me, but I don't really care about the relationship. Okay, and so these considerations kind of maybe help you maneuver between the particular strategies. Relative power is something else that you can consider. Do you have more power than this other person to use kind of a forcing strategy? Are we equals? Okay, so what does that look like? If the other person has more power than me, I might be at the mercy of what strategy they want to use, and so I might go in with a collaborating strategy, but because they have more position power or personal power or whatever it might be, I might not have that luxury to choose a strategy. They might kind of choose it for us. And so kind of looking at that, and these are all things that I would consider before I go in to have this conversation, right? Before I address the conflict, I would maybe want to recognize kind of where I fall in these different considerations. The last one is time constraints. So time constraints, how quickly does this need to get resolved? Does this need to get resolved immediately? Or do we have time to talk and to brainstorm and to, kind of go back and forth? So time constraints is the only consideration really that if I have tight time constraints and I don't have a lot of time, this is the only consideration that takes collaboration off the table. Because collaboration is not a quick strategy. It just takes time to be able to resolve a conflict through collaboration. And so that's really the only time that collaboration is not an option. Right. But any other combination of all these, we can always collaborate and try to get kind of that win-win outcome. All right. And so when we look at, I was like going backwards there. So if we look at kind of a default strategy, we would recommend the collaboration approach just because it comes out with that win-win kind of outcome, and that helps the outcome actually get implemented and helps to actually resolve the issue. I'm going to go through some slides that kind of give us a framework to use the collaborative approach in a conflict situation. And so just some overarching things to kind of think about that will help kind of the collaborative approach work better is if you can establish some overarching goals that kind of both parties agree to, that we both want to accomplish long term, making sure that, again, you're really focused on the problem and not the people, right? So we want a problem focused, not people focused, and that's kind of goes back to that earlier lecture. If we can focus on the interest and not the position, this is really trying to understand, where are they coming from? So I get that I'm on this side of the line and they're on the other side of the line, hence we have this conflict, but why are they on that side of the line? What's driving that? And most likely I can understand, right, why they feel the way they do if I understand those interests, right? And so we can maybe start from there and really focus on those interests, because those are the things that we're trying to satisfy with a common solution. So that's definitely a good kind of point to kind of think about. If you can use objective criteria for evaluating alternatives. So again, this goes back to our problem-solving approach that we talked about back in chapter 3, when we look at, looking at solutions objectively. If we can kind of have these interests that we've just talked about, these are the things that we need to be able to check all these boxes in order for this approach to work fully for both parties. That will kind of help in that evaluating process. So if you look at this is essentially the problem-solving approach that we talked about at the beginning of the semester. And when we start using the collaborative approach, we're going to focus on kind of steps 1 and 2 and things that we can do to kind of get this conversation started and on the right foot. And then steps 3 and 4, you're going to really just going to follow through like you would, in any situation of kind of implementing the action plan and following up. So if you're the initiator of the problem, if you're the initiator of the conversation, really, and you're trying to kind of bring this problem, this conflict, to the attention of the other party, some things that you want to kind of think about, and this again is pulling from our supportive communication chapter. We want to make sure that we're using owning statements, right? So you want to maintain personal ownership of the problem. I think that this is an issue. I have seen this happen, and avoid kind of using they, type of pronouns. Make sure that, again, you're being descriptive. You're describing the problem in terms of behavior, the consequences of that behavior, how it made you feel, okay? Making sure that you're validating, you're encouraging two-way discussion between yourself and the other party. All right, and you really want to have this conversation that we want to stay in this phase until really the problem's understood, that we agree that this is an issue type of thing. Now, if you're the responder, so if someone approaches you about a particular conflict, making sure that you're open and willing to listen to what the initiator in this case has to say. So you want to establish that type of environment, that climate for problem solving, and so this is really, trying not to get defensive, asking questions to, seek additional information, especially if they're not being very descriptive, asking those questions to try to get more specifics from the other person, and try to agree with something that they're saying. You might not agree with how they perceive, or their thoughts on some things, but maybe you can agree at maybe how they understood, how they interpret that, from their perspective. And so again, this is all helps the conversation continue in a productive way. Right? So as a responder, we really have to be disciplined to not get defensive and really encourage the conversation and not shut the other person down. Now, the third role would be a mediator role. And so if you become a mediator, then, your role's a little different. You're trying to make sure that the two parties involved are doing these things that we just talked about, that they're, allowing you're allowing both parties to kind of get some airtime. So again, the mediator's role is not to resolve the issue. It's not to take sides. And so if you're trying to help two people or two groups resolve a conflict, then you really need to help facilitate that conversation and really stay neutral when doing so. And so your role is to really ensure that there's fairness, that both parties are giving the other party a chance to kind of speak their piece and to kind of get their perspective in there, and then making sure that the other party does the same. And maybe trying to help guide the conversation by making sure that they are looking at the interest and not just so focused on the positions that they're holding at this point. All right, and so once we can kind of work through that first phase, now we can agree that there's an issue, and now we can start kind of looking at solutions. And so again, as the initiator, look for commonalities, things that we can agree on, things that are common from both parties, as a way to kind of start the generation phase. Things again that can really that focus on those interests. Okay, and so we can come up with some really good solutions that weren't maybe the original solution I wanted, but it's a solution that really focuses on my interest and focuses on the other party's interests. As the responder, if someone comes to you and has this conflict and brings this conflict to your attention, don't feel like you have to be the one that resolves it because they're telling you that you have this issue or whatever. And so, ask for suggestions. What are you thinking? What do you think would work, or what do you think would be better? And so again, to really encourage that resolution and encourage that conversation, instead of just, taking your ball and going home, or, feeling like you have to come up with a solution that again might not work because the other party wasn't involved in it. And so making sure that we still are going back and forth here, even at this phase 2. And then as the mediator, again, just making sure that both parties are doing this. Both parties are thinking of solutions and considering the other's interests when coming up with solutions. Being creative at this stage it could be really important when we're trying to make a solution that meets everyone's needs. All right, because we're really trying to get this win-win. And then once we accomplish phase 2, then we can create the action plan and a schedule and be able to follow up. But those are more administrative things at that point, right? We've really gotten through the hard piece if we've made it to that phase 3, and we agree on not only what the problem is, but we agree on some solution to move forward with, right? And then phase 3 and 4, again, more of the administrative kind of piece of it and the actual doing piece of it. All right, so hopefully by now, after kind of listening and reading to the conflict chapter, you understand the different sources of conflict. You understand the importance of making sure that conflict stays kind of issue focused. to try to avoid that defensiveness. Recognizing that there are several different strategies that you can use to resolve conflict, and knowing that some strategies are going to be better depending on those situational considerations that you might evaluate. But when in doubt, collaboration is always a good approach, and really kind of weaving in that supportive communication at that point can take that conversation a long way. All right, so hopefully you understand those concepts. If not, let me know.